Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pod Friends. I'm your host, Matt Scott. That phenomenal song was the Pod Friends theme song by the one and only Will from America, who you could actually hear on a phenomenal episode of another podcast on this network, Rob and Akiva Need a Podcast for Nap, just in the last week or so. So check him out. Check out Will. Will's amazing. Hopefully, one day Will be a guest on Pod Friends. And how are you doing? I want to know, how are you doing? I feel like I'm caffeinated. I am getting started going in hot to this episode of Pod Friends because what I know and what you'll soon find out is that this was really a phenomenal conversation. And I mean this with all due respect to a phenomenal guest today who I'll talk about. That this is one of those hidden gems, one of those podcasts where, you see the name, maybe you don't know that name in particular, but that's the reason to listen and to tune in. And Greg and I talked about that. We recognize that going into this week's episode. And if you are just seeing Greg's name, if you're tuning in because you're a Pod Friends friend, a friend of the pod, I think that's someone else's thing. But if you're tuning in anyway, without knowing Greg, without loving him already, well, then thank you for tuning in. And I'm excited for what this next hour and 15 minutes or so has in store. Greg Dunlap. Greg is phenomenal, and he's someone that I really admire in this community because of his emphasis on community. Pod Friends is all about highlighting people in this Rob Has a Podcast community. And Greg is someone who is, not only cares about community, but has a podcast called This Must Be the Place, where he has interviewed me. He's interviewed Rob Cesternino, head of the Rob Has a Podcast network. Sorry, I get choked up a little bit sometimes when I talk about Rob and how phenomenal he is. But Greg is a patron of Rob Has a Podcast. He's a web developer, a pinball enthusiast, a punk rocker. And he really has brought so much of this DIY, do it yourself spirit that's in the punk rock world into his own life. And we talk about so many things, but one of the things I'm so thankful for in this conversation is just how Greg was so open talking about his experiences with sobriety and being a recovering alcoholic for the last 30 years. We talk about that label and why it's important, why that representation of alcoholism and recovery is so important. The stereotypes that sometimes people might have, and how how those kind of get in the way sometimes for people to raise their hand and say, hey, this is something I'm going through. And so, super meaningful conversation. And I'm really thankful that Greg lent his expertise and his perspective, his experience to this conversation. So I hope that folks appreciate that. And I'll also say, one thing that I acknowledge in this podcast is that this pandemic has been a wild time for a lot of people. I know folks that have been drinking a lot more because of the pandemic since the start of it. And if you're going through it and if you're struggling, there are people who've also been through it, like Greg, who you could reach out to, who have advice, who are there to support you, who are there to help you get to wherever you want to be, whatever that looks like. If anything, also, I think it's just a beautiful conversation because it's a good opportunity to reflect on all of us. Like, how are we doing? Are there things we're using as a crutch? And so I really love this conversation with Greg. If you have people you want to nominate for this podcast, Greg was actually one of the early nominations for this podcast. You can go to bit.ly/podfriendsnom. That's bit.ly/podfriendsnom as a nomination. Otherwise, just want to direct you to follow me and tag me and tweet me on social media at MattScottGW, at Hey Pod Friends. Love to hear what you think as Greg and I talk about the end of this conversation. Also, as I started to ask last week, please submit a voicemail. Speakpipe.com/podfriends is where you could submit a voicemail. I know I put that out there last week, and we have received a resounding one voicemail. Thank you so much to that person for submitting a voicemail. You know who you are. But all to say, if you're listening, if you love anything about these different conversations, if you think back to a Pod Friends conversation that you appreciated, like submit a voicemail, because one day I want to do a kind of retrospective episode with just voicemails, and you could just talk anonymously or introduce yourself, but just 90 seconds of something that jumps out or was meaningful to you from Pod Friends. In addition, the last thing I just want to plug, I mentioned that Greg is a patron of Rob Has a Podcast, and now is the start of the month. So it's a great time to become a patron of RHAP, and you could do that at patreon.com/RHAP. And why do you want to do that, I ask? Well, you meet community, you build community, you make friends. Like being part of this Rob Has a Podcast community, not only as a podcaster, but as a patron and otherwise, has been honestly life-changing for me, with the people I've met and the community I've built virtually, which is then translated to a lot of in-person connections and meaningful connections. And so if you become a patron, there is an exclusive patron-only podcast feed. There are weekly patron-only podcasts. There are news about upcoming live shows whenever those are taking place, and sometimes exclusive access to tickets, and so much more, like patron games and activities. And I'll pop up and participate in those, especially since doing Podfriends. I just love to have that opportunity to interact. That's why I have the voicemails. That's why I'm a patron, and that's why I'm doing Podfriends. So without further ado, let me get started introducing Greg. Making his way to the podcast, hailing from Monterey, California, by way of Portland, Oregon, Sweden, and Illinois. He's an RHAP patron, a pinball pioneer, a punk rocker, a web developer, a super fan of Rob and Akiva Need a Podcast, the winner of the Renap Stand tournament for his love of pinball, and an incredible human who is 30 years sober. Please give a warm welcome to your pod friend and mine, Greg Dunlap. So I don't typically ask people to introduce themselves on Pod Friends, but Greg, could you introduce yourself? Give us the elevator pitch of Greg Dunlap.
Wow.
It's an awkward way to say that, by the way.
It's funny because it's kind of funny. Wouldn't you think that somebody else could give your own elevator pitch better than you can? Because I feel like sometimes I could give somebody else's, because the complexity and fullness of your own life.
Exactly.
But I'm Greg Dunlap. I'm 53 years old. I live in Monterey, California. Professionally, I am involved in technology. I work for a company that builds websites. I'm officially in a field called content strategy, and it's too complicated to, it's weird. It's complicated, but it's not. And usually when people ask me what I do, I just say I build websites. It's just easier that way, and people can understand it. But I lead a team of content strategy professionals at a company called Lullabot, and we build big websites. Yeah.
Nice. So, and I think that beyond that, if people are just tuning in, if for some reason someone just skipped ahead
so
and
why are you here?
No, well, I mean, that's it. I mean, go ahead. I don't need to ask the questions, Greg. I'm just gonna probably wait. Actually, no. I have a great question.
Okay.
Why are you here?
Well, I mean, I got involved in the Rob Has a Podcast community a couple of years ago. I am fairly new to the community compared to a lot of people. But basically what happened was I started watching Survivor in the beginning, like day one, Survivor watcher, season one, very into Survivor, got very deep into it for a long time. Probably watched until around season 12 or 13. And like a lot of people kind of fell out of it after that. Right. And then fast forward like a decade, and I met a woman who's my wife now, and the new season of Survivor was starting, and she's like, oh, we should watch Survivor. And I'm like, that show's still on. And and she's like, yeah, we should watch. And the season that we ended up watching was Kagayan, which of course was like one of the all-time great Survivor seasons. And then she brought me back to rewatch all of the stuff that had happened since then. And I started really nerding out about Survivor, and I had a group text with a couple of pinball people I know who are also into Survivor, and one of them was like, hey, that guy Rob Sesternino who was on Survivor Amazon has a podcast about Survivor. And I started listening, and that happened right around the beginning of the pandemic. And and that was, and season 39 was on. And so and that was really great because it was like all of this like chaos and stuff was happening, and we were all stuck at home and stuff like this. But Survivor and the podcast especially became like a lifeline for me, like during that time. Like, and I've heard a lot of people say this too, because it's like, it's so stupid. It's like Survivor, it's reality TV. But on the other hand, it's like, it gives you something else to focus on. And especially during that time, I got really into, I like did a full re-listen of Rob and Akivanita podcast, and I was like going back and listening to old episodes of the Wiggle Room and stuff like that, like anything that was like the goofiest, lightest stuff, which is weird for me because usually I'm into the most deepest, serious, strategic stuff. But like during that time, that made me really that was really what I needed at that time. And so, and then I started getting into the community. I became a patron, et cetera, et cetera. And then, you know, like I was on Renap talking about pinball one time, and, you know, all of that stuff. I had Rob on my podcast, et cetera.
Yes, this must be the place. And
yeah, that's right.
I think that first of all, this is wild because in my head, Greg, I'm like, Greg has been around. He's here. He's established as a patron. I didn't realize that you were such a new patron or new part of the community beyond being a patron. And the second thing is, how in the world did you do a full, like, how did you catch up on Rob and Akiva Needs a podcast? No, I mean, and I say this as someone who's listened from, I think I listened from probably episode 15 or 20, and then kind of caught up on a lot of those, and then of course have been listening ever since. I was actually just finally on it a couple weeks ago, which was really cool. But yeah, what, like, you I think that, like, before kind of just asking the question of like how you caught up on that, like, it sounds like this is ridiculous, Greg. I was gonna say it sounds like there was a lot going on, but we all know there was a lot going on at the start of the pandemic, and a lot going on, and also not a lot going on at the same time. It's kind of dark irony, but yeah. Like, what could you kind of talk me through that? Like, where were you with life, with things when the pandemic started? I ask that because for me, I was and we talked about community on This Must Be the Place, and I was talking to you about like the work I was doing, which was with NASA on the International Space Apps Challenge, this global hackathon event, which is really based in community, but also in the global spirit of things, it was already so virtual. So I was like very familiar with Zoom from about 2016 onward. My calendar didn't change much. For instance, like when the pandemic hit, it just I went from working in an office with a couple people on a kind of hybrid remote team to working at home. So the shift was thankfully for me not that ridiculous, and I know that's a privilege, but for you, what was that shift like, and what was going on that propelled you into the insanity of catching up on Rob and Akiva Needs a Podcast, probably 100 something episodes in?
It was interesting because I had just moved to Monterey. I had lived in Portland, Oregon for 8 years, and my wife had come up to live with me there, and she was in the Bay Area at the time, and she grew up in Carmel, which is the city next to Monterey. And she had always wanted to move back here. And so, I was like, well, you moved up here and we lived here for a while, so let's go back down to California. And we came here, and we had only gotten here like 4 months before the pandemic hit. So I was in a very new place. And we had just bought a new house when the lockdown happened. And it's weird because, like, for me, a lot of things didn't change either. The company that I work for is fully virtual. So I've been working at home for like 10 years at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And so that didn't change. But like I remember like when the lockdown order came down, and I just remember like taking the dog out for a walk, and like everything was different, and it was like, and I'm just like walking around my neighborhood, and I'm
Yeah.
not seeing anybody, but it just like it was just felt like everything was different, and everything was heavier, and what's the future going to hold, and could this person walking across the street from me be making me get sick and die, and all of this, and
Yeah.
it's like so
Real.
from that. Yeah, and from that perspective, all of that stuff was weighing on all of us because there was a lot more uncertainty back then than there is now. I mean, there's still
Mhm.
uncertainty, but at least like we understand a lot more than we did back then.
Yeah.
And so that summer we had a project we were doing where we were re-landscaping our front yard, and I was building a giant fence and all these garden beds and stuff like this. And I would just go out there and work all day and listen to podcasts. And so
Wow.
I was like, I need some podcasts to listen to. And I had been listening to some of the past Survivor podcasts and catching up on that stuff and stuff. But also that kind of some of that stuff was stuff that I wanted to be able to pay a little more attention to than I was, like while I'm like, cutting boards and nailing them together and stuff. And so I had tried Renap a couple of times, and I was thinking it was really fun, and I really liked the interplay between Rob and Akiva and the guests and stuff like that. And I'm like, I'll
Mhm.
just start this over. And so that summer, I did 150 episodes of Renap
Oh
or
my
whatever it
gosh.
was. Yeah.
That has to be like the title of this episode, like Greg Dunlap, 150 episodes of Renap and Counting, or
Yes,
something
what I'll
like
always be remembered for.
150 episodes of Renap. How long would you say it took for you? Well, I
I
guess it
don't know.
wasn't 150 at the time, but how
No, it
long
was
was it to get
probably
through
it
what
was
you got through?
probably at the time a little over 100 or
Right.
110, a
Yeah.
couple hours each, 10 full days, 10 24-hour days.
Was that like 3 months of listening for you,
Yeah,
or
probably. It was
oh my
probably a
gosh,
summer, yeah.
that's a
And
lot.
there was other
That's
stuff I was
wild.
listening to during that time, I mean, it's not like it was all Renap all the time. It was like Big Brother was on and all of
Yeah.
that too. So, there was other stuff going on, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it's something that I've related to a lot with a lot of different guests is just how podcasting, I think one of the beautiful things is that in times where things are really tough and challenging, I've talked about this a little bit before on the podcast, but I discovered RHAP after my dad passed away in
Mhm.
2017, coincidentally through Twitter. I think I followed Johnny Fairplay, and like I went on my Twitter and I saw him retweet or tweet something about being on something with Rob, and I was like, "Oh, okay. I guess I'll just listen to this thing because, sometimes when things are really rough, you're kind of looking for just like voices to
Mhm.
fill that void. And as the iconic Bryce Isaiah says, like friends in your head and all of that. And so I think that's one of the beautiful things about this community and what that does. Just to kind of stop in on the Rob and Akiva thing, though, they have such a particular dynamic, and I
Mhm.
at some point, like, I transparently, for the listeners, I don't care if you know this, but like whenever Pod Friends is all said and done, I want Rob, I think, to be like the last episode, just to basically, and I told Rob this, but like just to fact check all of the other things that people said about him. Like we'll go through and be like, is this true? Is it not true? Just the reactions podcast basically to like all of the Pod Friends episodes essentially. But beyond that, Akiva is also someone that I want to have on, hopefully sometime soon. And one, like, I don't know if you could talk more about like what it was that you loved about that dynamic, but you were able to be part of that dynamic at least a couple times. I don't how has it been like 3 times
Twice.
maybe that you've been on Renap?
Twice. Yeah,
Twice that you've been
twice.
on Renam. So what was like it about that very particular dynamic, which I also love, that kind of stuck out for you? And then what was it like to actually, as a listener, just like all the people who are tuning in, like what was it like to actually be part of it?
I think that the thing that I liked about the dynamic is I like things that are really meta. And one of the things I like about Robin Akiva Need a Podcast is that much of the podcast is spent trying to figure out how to do the podcast.
Mhm.
And I find that really, really hilarious. I just like,
Yeah.
the time that they spend on the mailbag and what they're going to put on the wheel and the Constitution and what are the rules and all of this kind of stuff is like I loved the idea that there is this podcast about how to make a podcast, and
Mhm.
and that like got their listeners involved and all of that stuff, and so that was really cool to me. But the other thing I really liked is I really like podcasts or anything in life really that
Yeah.
take things that are not very serious far too seriously. And
Mhm.
and that's definitely the case here too, because it's like, when they talk about like, the fact that they have a constitution to govern the rules by which things go on the wheel and all of this kind of stuff, and
Right,
all
yeah.
of the time that they spend on like, goofy TV shows, and that there's a 2-hour episode about that weird TV show Dinosaurs that exists and stuff.
Mhm.
It's like I loved that aspect too. And then of course the dynamic between them is really interesting and fascinating as well. But it's like all of those things really got me. Those were the things that I really loved about it. And then being on it was like, so I was on it twice. One time was as part of Renap X, where everybody came on and gave a talk. And I
Right.
gave a talk about how every year in Sweden at Christmas time they make a gigantic straw goat, and every year people try to burn it down. And it was like it didn't work. And the thing is, it's like a very funny presentation, and I've given it to crowds before. That's why I thought it would work really well. But the thing is, it's like the kind of thing where without a crowd of people it doesn't work. It's like a lot of comedy is like that. It's like
Mm.
the crowds feed off themselves, and so I didn't think that worked. I don't know, maybe people just thought it was dumb too. But then the second one was when I went on to talk about, they did the world's biggest stand, and I went on to talk
Yes.
about how I'm a big fan of pinball, and that was a lot more fun because then I got to be very, very serious about something that's kind of ridiculous, and I'm very good at that. So and
But
and and I got named world's biggest stand, so that was cool too.
we love that. And you know what? In we have to talk about pinball, and we'll get into that.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
like I know when I think of Renap, I think of not only the right now there's the mailbag song with Phil T, Jack Fox,
Mhm.
awesome stuff. But also the iconic theme song. Greg, I know that you are a musical person. Do you ever just find yourself like singing the Renap theme song, to yourself or anything like
I
that?
I plead the fifth.
Because if you want to sing it on the
No,
podcast, I
no,
think people will.
absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Robin Akiva need
No,
a
no,
podcast. You could do
no,
like the
no.
nice like musical theater type
I
of.
do like the musical version. The slow musical version
That's what I was
by
going for.
yeah, that I actually think
Jason
that was
Curtis
kind of
Rivera, I
nice. Yeah, by
believe.
Jason Cruz Rivera.
And
Yeah, that's really
yes.
cool.
Yeah,
Yes.
so but so on that note, it's I there's so many different places to go with your story and to, like, to dive in and to talk about. But one of the things I again, you touched on pinball. You kind of told folks about it. You made it really far in the stand tournament, from what I
I
remember.
won.
On the basis of, you won.
Oh yeah.
You won.
Yeah.
Where's your trophy? I don't see your trophy.
Uh,
That's why
I didn't
I
get
don't.
a trophy. I don't get a trophy. I can get a five timers hat. I
Awkward.
can get anything. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, you'll get a
I didn't
five
even get to
timers
be
hat
on a
one day.
mailbag because the episode went so long they didn't do one.
Do you have any ideas that you've just been sitting on ever
No,
since then?
no, I
Okay.
didn't have any ideas. Every
I don't know if
and
you've just
and
been waiting to share
no, I've
those.
only gotten one idea on the wheel ever. So
What
it
was
was
that idea?
Kelly White's wedding.
Oh, so
Yeah.
okay, that's kind of a big idea,
Yeah, that
someone's
was a good one.
entire
Yeah. Yeah.
matrimony.
Yeah.
But, like you talked about pinball, and it is kind of it's not that it's a goofy topic in any way. I used to take pinball very seriously back in the day
Mm.
at the arcades as a kid. I was very competitive. But I'm curious, like, what is your history with pinball? Because I will say, I'll admit, I did some research, and I know that you're other than just loving pinball and being part of community, you have a deep history with it. I don't know where it started, but yeah, how does someone become a pinball stan?
Well, I first started playing pinball in the early 90s. And we're going to go way back in time. It's interesting because I was listening to David Bloomberg's Pod Friends podcast, and
Yeah.
his background, as far as his relationship to the internet and stuff like that, is very similar to mine. And
Uh,
we're of a similar age, so it's not that
uh,
surprising. But
yeah.
um, I had gotten out of college, and there was a place across the street from me that had a pinball machine, and we had kind of been
Mhm.
playing it just for fun or whatever. And I was dating a girl who had access to the internet, and it was very, very early, like
Whoa.
1992 or something like that, like pre World Wide Web and all of that stuff. And
Was she like a Rockefeller or like someone like that? Sound
no,
I don't
she was going to the University of Chicago schools,
Oh,
and they had like, and through that was like the main way you would get into the internet back then, was through educational institutions.
that makes
And
sense.
so as a part of that, I was able to kind of get an account through her. And the internet version of discussion groups back then was called Usenet. And there was
Mm.
a pinball group on Usenet, and she's like, "Hey, I found this pinball group on Usenet. You should join." And so I joined, and I was kind of looking at that. And then one day, me and her went to see a band play, because we were both involved in the music scene in Chicago,
Mhm.
in Indiana. And we got there very early, and we're kind of looking for something to do. And we saw a laundromat in a strip mall near where the band was playing, and there were
Mhm.
like 40 pinball machines in there. And she was like, "Let's go in there and we can play some pinball,"
What?
right? And
Yeah.
one of the pinball machines that was in there was called Twilight Zone, this pinball machine that you see right behind me right
Oh
now.
my gosh, that's a
And
pinball machine.
yeah, that's
Watch the YouTube version.
two pinball machines sitting behind me.
Oh my gosh.
And I ended up playing it for like 3 hours, and I was just obsessed with this game. And through that, I started getting more involved in finding places to play pinball in the city, and getting more involved in this Usenet news group. And then, as a result of that, one of the things, I was in Chicago, and Chicago is the has been and always will be the basis for where all of the pinball manufacturing in the world has always happened. And so,
Mhm.
and as a result of that, oftentimes the manufacturers would take games out to test them at arcades before they would put them out into production, and they would go check those games. And so if you were out there playing, you could meet the people who worked at the pinball companies.
Mhm.
And so I was playing this game, and this guy came in, and he's like, "Hey, I need to get in there to check the software." And we were talking about it, and I was like, "Oh, I posted about this on the news group." And he's like, "Oh yeah, I saw that, blah blah blah." And he's like, "There's a big pinball tournament coming up in a couple of weeks. You should go." And I'm like, "I'm not very good, blah blah blah." And he's like, "No, you should go. It'll be really fun. It's not, you should just go and hang out." And so I decided to go. And that was my first experience with competitive pinball. It was in 1994. And at that tournament, I met like 10 people who are like some of my dearest friends still today. And that was like what really pushed me into learning to be better at pinball, about getting into competitive pinball, about going to tournaments and shows and stuff like that. And then eventually getting a job in the pinball industry. And it just like took off from there. But another thing that's a big aspect of that is that, like, that was also kind of a tumultuous period of my life. And so like
Right.
I was, I was going through a very bad breakup with the woman who I had, it was just dramatic, with the woman who I had broke it, who had introduced me to pinball. And
Mm.
at the same time, um I was quitting drinking because I had had a really bad drinking problem for a long time. And pinball was like my escape from that, because like when I quit drinking, I I didn't have it's like a lot of people who quit drinking, a lot of people have a bad drinking problem. They get to the point where they a lot of they're so bad that a lot of the friends are also only people who also have a drinking problem, and so when they quit they don't have anybody, and I didn't have that. I had all of my friends were very supportive, and mostly they were just kind of like, thank God you're quitting drinking, we've been really worried about you. But the other thing is that like you've got this gap that you need to fill, because it's like it takes up it's such an enormous part of your life. And I needed to and there are a lot of things like I couldn't do, like going to see a band play. Like I didn't trust myself to go out to bars and stuff like that. And I remember very early on at one point like being next to somebody who like dropped a beer and spilled it all over me, and I was just like, this was like crazy, because I'm like smelling alcohol on me and stuff like that, and it's such a trigger. And so that's what pinball turned into for me. And I spent like a very long time. There's this game, it's called World Cup Soccer, and I spent much of my time playing that game just because it like gave me this outlet to focus my attention on, and all of that like also drove me to learn how to play better, how to understand pinball better, how to understand pinball rules better, and all of that kind of stuff. And it was like, and it also drove me into the pinball community more, because like I'm the kind of person who, for whatever reason, like I've always felt kind of like weird and like an outsider, and I've gotten friends through niche communities, and so that's what drove me in, and so that drove me into pinball more as well. And so it was like I love pinball and I find it fascinating and interesting for a lot of reasons, but it's like one of those things that came into my life at a time when I really needed it, and became a big part of my life because of that.
I honestly, number one, thank you for sharing. And I honestly wasn't expecting the combination of things at the same time. Like it sounds like
Yeah.
that must have been like 1994 or so that
Yeah.
all of
Yeah.
this was kind of going on. And I mean, transparently speaking for the listeners, I don't like to lie to my Pod Friends listeners. I like to them so much. You reached out at right when I started Pod Friends and kind of, mentions like, hey, here's my story. And if you're interested, we knew each other already, of course, at that point. And I was on your podcast, This Must Be the Place, in 2021, about mid 2021. And so, you reached out and kind of mentioned, alcoholism as something that was part of your journey. I didn't realize that it intersected with pinball and just all this other stuff, but I appreciate that you bring that up, because I think alcoholism is it's an interesting thing in the sense that like and you could probably make an analogy to so many different issues that people go through, but like when you're in it, it's probably, I would imagine, a lot harder to see than when you're out of it, just having friends who are also in recovery. And so I don't want you to to have to talk about it more than you're comfortable, but I am curious kind of what that you referenced or alluded to, like your and that's kind of one of the things that I think is a pattern, where it's like when your friends who are people
Yeah.
who are often like also maybe they have similar habits are concerned, like that's when they're I think one sign that there's a problem. But like what was I don't know, I'm almost curious, like what was your history with alcohol kind of before you quit? And then I'm excited to get to the point of you quitting, but I don't want to jump over that, because I know, especially with the pandemic, we started talking about that. A lot of people unfortunately could relate to alcohol being a huge crutch for them, and some listeners still might be able to relate to that. So yeah, what was that backstory? And also even just curious, like when you had your first drink.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's like a lot of people, there's a long history of alcoholism in my family. My mom is an alcoholic, and she's also bipolar, and that combination was pretty interesting for me growing up. And her father was an alcoholic, and my grandfather. And
Wow.
I had a lot of visibility into that. And like when I was in high school, she was already in recovery and she was in AA. And I had a lot of visibility into it, but I was also very much like when I was a kid, I felt very outcast. Like, not it's weird, like when I was thinking about this when I started the podcast, because it's like I wasn't like nerdy, like, but I just always felt very, very different from everybody around me. And like I cared about things that were very, very different from the people around me.
Mhm.
And I never really felt like I fit in. And I think that I actually was a user of marijuana before I started drinking heavily.
Mhm.
But a lot of that, I think, came from me trying to self-medicate in a way that made me feel comfortable around other people, basically.
Yeah.
And that and in a way, finding people who would accept me, because it's like I remember I first started smoking pot in high school when I met this guy named, his name's Eric, and he passed away a few years ago. But
Mhm.
he was like he was like somebody who accepted me, and this was a way for me to feel like we shared something together, right?
Yeah.
And it wasn't even something I really cared about that much. It was just like a way for me, again, to find a way in with people,
Mhm.
and when I got to college, it was drinking was more the thing. And so, everybody drinks, and so I'm going to drink too. And I'm the kind of person where I don't really do things halfway. um and um and
Uh,
and
yeah.
so and so it's like I found my way into the music scene there. But I was also like, again, it was very, very much a way for me to feel comfortable around other people and with other people, and find a way out of like my own brain, because I spent a lot of time like really stuck in my own brain.
Yeah.
Um and it's interesting now that I look back on it, because that was obviously, figuring out how to do that again after I quit drinking was something that I had to figure out with myself. And I've been sober for almost 30 years now.
Mm.
And but at the time it was like, I think, and I knew I had a problem for a long time before I quit. And I think a lot of that was like I couldn't comprehend what my life would look like and how I would interact with these people without that. And I think that's a lot of what people who fall into drugs and alcohol experience.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to be said about, like, does uh, you know about like addiction, and whether it's genetic or predisposed, or whether you're really addicted to the chemical. Or there's a lot of talk now about how addiction stems from a lack of connection with other people or stuff like that. Or
Mhm.
And I think there's a lot of all of those things. Like that, there's a lot of
Right.
people who self medicate for mental health problems through drugs and alcohol. And I think that all of those are probably true to varying extents in varying people.
Mhm.
But like for me, I never felt a physical craving. It was much more of a it was much more
Wow.
of because
Yeah.
it was never like that. It's not like somebody who's an heroin addict, and when they quit they go through withdrawal. And I never felt it like that. But it was much more psychological. Like
Right.
when I would smell it, it would bring me to a place where I was comfortable with people, and that's part of the compulsion. Or, like when I was around people, like for a long time, I would just walk around with an empty bottle in my hand, because this whole concept of walking around without a bottle of beer in my hand, it was like I didn't know what to do with myself.
Yeah.
Or I would drink non-alcoholic beer just to have that experience. And so for me it was much more psychological, and it was about habits, and it was about who I was when I wasn't drinking, and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to even hear you reflect on that and kind of pinpoint and obviously with definitely with the benefit of perspective now. Number one, congratulations on nearly 30 years sober.
Thank you.
That's powerful. And I think it's also interesting because especially for folks who don't know folks who are in recovery or who identify as recovering alcoholics, like to them it's like, oh well, you're not an alcoholic, like that's a thing that you did that was 30 years ago that you were an alcoholic, right? And so, I mean, I wasn't even planning on going to that question, but I'm assuming that that's something that you've considered or that comes up or that people ask about. Like, and I'm curious, even as someone who like is not who does drink, but is not an alcoholic or does not identify as one. Like, why? I wonder why is it important to you to like carry that label? Because I know it's important for a lot of people, but I'd love if you could kind of make sense for those who might not get it.
It's interesting because for years I didn't. I specifically avoided
Wow.
it. And one of the reasons was because I felt like, especially many years ago, I felt like the label held a connotation that I didn't want to hold myself to with people. And
Right.
I think that's not as true anymore now. I think people have a lot more understanding of addiction issues and stuff now than they may have in the past. Um, and it's only been very, very recently that I've started to think of myself using that term. And
Mm.
part of it was more as a way to say, like, this is something that I acknowledge about myself to people. But it's like when people if I'm out and I'm not drinking and somebody's like, you don't drink, and I'm like, oh no, I don't. And it's like, even now I won't say no, I'm a recovering alcoholic or anything like that. Like, I
Yeah.
still have a problem with that label myself.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because I think labels like that are just like if you say the word alcoholic, it's like, oh, is that person an alcoholic? And it's like there's something that has a definition,
Right.
like it's something you can like say, oh yeah, you meet these 5 criteria, so you're an alcoholic. And I
Yeah.
don't necessarily think that's helpful in a lot of cases, because to me it's like, if you feel like alcohol is causing a problem in your life, then that's a problem to be solved. And whether you fit these 5 criteria around this word is irrelevant, right? it's
Yeah.
it's like it's like if this is causing issues in your life, then that's something that you should address, and the
Mhm.
rest of it is kind of irrelevant as far as I'm concerned. um but on the other hand, for me to be able to publicly use that word about myself and say I identify myself as this, I think can be a very powerful tool. Just like I know that you are identify
Yeah.
as a queer man. And so it's like,
Yeah.
it's the same thing. Like, for you to be able to say, hey, this is me and this is a part of who I am, is, I assume, very powerful for you as well. But I
Yeah.
also know that many people in the queer community had a lot of problems identifying themselves or finding the terms to use for themselves too.
Yeah.
So it seems to me to be like I'm not equating myself with the queer community, and I'm very privileged, and I've never been like looked down on or punished or felt marginalized because of my situation. But on the other hand, just in terms of like how we
Totally.
identify ourselves and use the terms and stuff like that, I feel like there's a lot of parallels there.
Yeah, and I think that those parallels are helpful to find because in, the way that my brain works, at least, it's big on those. Like, it's recognizing that when it comes to someone's story, like, the point is not that they're going to necessarily even say like, oh, I have a drinking problem and I need to address that. And if someone walks away with that, that's great. Or to say like, I live in Monterey so I could relate to Greg. It's like, no, 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 no. Like, there's so many different parallels and things that we could transfer. And I think it's also important to like assume best intentions even when people are kind of making those connections, because we don't often make those connections between other people's experiences. And when we do that, it is a lot easier to feel community. It's a lot
Hmm.
less hard to feel alone when you're able to see connections like across your identities, because like I've definitely been the only black person, queer person, probably a list of other things, because we all have like probably a million identities, or thousands of identities, or hundreds, or whatever we could point to within who we are, even if it's just our interests. And I think that's valuable and a good comparison. And there is something powerful to speaking that out into the world, especially because as you talked about alcoholism and some of the perceptions, like I'm already thinking, like, yeah, like, well, and I'll also say, like, this is so my perspective is so much different now, in particular, from just knowing people. Like, one of my best friends who I actually met in the grief group I went to after my dad died, she's an alcoholic, and she hasn't had a drink since I've known her over the last 5 years. And and actually one cool thing that I love that she does, and I won't say her name, but I think she's like very vocal, and she's on YouTube and talks about her alcoholism and everything else, I believe. But and maybe I'll mention her in the intro of the episode. But anyway, like she like gets bird tattoos on her side every single year on that anniversary of when she quit drinking. And it's that for me has helped me shape my view of alcoholics, in the sense of like realizing that it's not all of the horrible things that we might think of. Like, maybe it's even, instead of like stating some of those, like I'd encourage people to think about their own biases and misconceptions with that. But this kind of brings me to another question I have for you, which I guess I don't have a sense of, which I guess is why I ask. But like, why, like for you, it's one thing to be able to speak about something, to like own your experience and feel that empowerment intrinsically, I'll say, or maybe there's another word for that, but to feel that empowerment for yourself is also the other piece, maybe on top of it being intrinsic. But the other piece of this that I wonder is, like, obviously you also were definitely open to speaking about this or sharing this with our community, right? And so I'm kind of curious why that was, or why that is important to you, assuming it's important to you. I'm kind of curious why you think that's a story that needs to be told, or why that's a story that you want to get out there.
That's or maybe
it's a big question. Maybe, actually, I'll say this.
I mean, obviously,
it's kind of loaded with the assumption of that you do want to share. But I assume, because like we're here on the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I brought it up to you, so I must have wanted to share at some level. I think that. First off, I feel like addiction issues aren't talked about enough. And then when they are, right, they're often talked about in the abstract, right? Or they're talked about in terms of, someone who's struggling, right, with an addiction issue. And I know that a lot of times in media, the addiction is seen as a dead end or something that results in an inevitable crash. And one of my kind of pet peeves about tropes in television and media is that you never see the happy ending to an addiction story. Like, one of the things that I hated about The Wire, which, to be clear, is an incredible piece of media, is that in the middle of The Wire, the main character becomes sober, and by the end they're drinking again. And it's like, I realized that part of the story is about somebody who is self-destructive. But on the other hand, it's like, I would love to see a story about somebody who gets sober and gets their life together, and that's it. That's the curtain call, and that really bothered me. And another one was in House of Cards season 1. There's a story about a character who has an alcohol problem, and a major plot point is about using that alcohol problem against him to get political motives going. And that really, it really shook me up in a way that I never would have expected, because it's like, to take somebody's weakness and vulnerability like that and turn it around on them intentionally is a very, very dark thing to me. And so it's like, there is very much an other side to addiction issues for many people. And I think that it's important to show that other side, and that there is success and happiness and joy on the other side of it for many people, and probably for many people in our lives that we don't even know about, but it's also important for people who are struggling to understand that too. Like, I am sure that there are people who are going to hear this who are struggling with their own issues. And I know that there were times when I was struggling with my issues and I couldn't see the other side of it either. But that other side does exist. And it's not always a straight line. There are many, many many people who go through, I went through several cycles of attempting to quit drinking before it actually stuck. And many people go through those cycles. And I think that people have a tendency when that happens to see themselves as a failure when they relapse or when they begin using again. And I don't see it that way at all, because if you are continuing to try and you are continuing to show up and you are continuing to know that this is something that's important in your life, then that's the important part, and you will get there eventually. And to keep trying is important, is the really big deal. There's a woman named Julian Baker who's a singer-songwriter, and she has been very open in a lot of interviews about how she is a, semi-recovered addict who does not feel like they've reached the end of their journey yet and continues to relapse. And she has a song in her last album called Crying Wolf that's about that. And it's like I saw a lot of reviews because it's a song about somebody who's in recovery but relapsing, and I saw a lot of reviews that were talking about how it's a song about the failure to succeed at something you're trying at. And I saw it exactly the opposite way. I saw it as a song about somebody who understands what's important to them and is continuing to try despite the failure. Right. And I think that's a really, really important perspective to keep.
I love that. And I appreciate you sharing all this too, because I know, like, whoever's listening, I know that there's something that they'll be able to get from this or take away from this, is even just that idea that you ended on there, which is this idea of like, you're not a failure because of your faults and because of the challenges that you have or because of the things that you're going through. Like, I was having a conversation earlier today, and one of the things that that I brought up is like, there will always be there are often challenges for us, but like each day that we're breathing, we have the chance to address them and like turn those into something that's better and more beautiful, to turn those into learning or growth experiences. Sure, those things are horrible and could tear us apart and turn out really, really badly, but also we have the opportunity to kind of turn things around and kind of find the positive, or find a brighter day on the other side of things. And you've referenced like music and the punk rock scene, and you've talked about like community a little bit, and I'm thinking about 1994 as like this pivotal year, where there's a lot of shifts. And I was thinking about your involvement in music, because I was a little familiar with that before this podcast. And it's interesting because part of what went through my head was like this question of, well, like in the music scene, you're in these venues and a lot of people are drinking and all that. But then I also think what's really interesting, and I don't know, I can't really wrap my head around it, but a lot of performers, I mean, maybe you have like the full spectrum, right? Where we've seen folks who kind of struggle with substances of different sorts and are these artists and creatives. But then I've also seen many instances of people who are like straight edge and don't touch a thing, and like that's kind of where they are, and they're these brilliant performers and in that scene. And I am like curious kind of what being part of that scene, especially like onward from 94, as you kind of continued to build toward where you are today, 30 years sober. Like, one, I don't know if you touched on this at all a little bit. Like, one, how did you get involved in the music scene? But like, more importantly, what role did that play for you? I don't want to frame everything in relation to like alcoholism and the choice to get sober, but I am kind of curious, like what role or how you've kind of navigated that, and what role that community has played for you in terms of the punk rock scene.
It was interesting before I started. So I do we're an hour in. And so it's a little, but I do, or did, depending on how we want to look at it, a podcast about community and building community called This Must Be the Place. And before I started it, I recorded an intro podcast that I actually never released, but I recorded. It just seemed a little too much like white guy talking about himself to me at the time. But it was about how when I was in high school, I was getting very into, I was getting very into different music than a lot of the people around me were. And I had a subscription to Rolling Stone, which at the time was kind of a hip thing to be reading. And they had a feature and a rave review of an album by a band that I and not really many people had ever heard of at the time, called U2. And the album was called War, and I went out and got it, and I just based on this review and that it had a cool album cover, and I instantly fell in love with this band. And and several years later, I got to go see them for the first time. And again, I'm kind of a nerdy outsider at school, and this band is starting to really get big and popular. And I couldn't find anyone to go see this show with me. And so I went by myself, and my parents dropped me off at the venue. And at the end of the show, they had this song called 40 that they would always close with. And it has this repeated line that they sing at the end. And this whole crowd of like 10,000 people were like singing along with this line. And as they left the stage, like this crowd just kept singing over and over. And I actually went out and found a recording of this actual show that I was at. And you could hear it, like 10,000 people singing this line over and over. And as they walked out of the venue and as they walked out into the street, like chanting this line over and over, and just like the passion and love for this music that all of these people had together at once. And it was a really powerful moment for me. And what it was, the moment for me was that it was the moment that I realized that my people were out there, right? My people who I understood and who would understand me existed. And when I got to college, it was actually shocking how quickly I found those people. And it was all based around music and the music that we loved and the music that we cared about. And I started then like doing things like I would rent a venue, and me and my friend Dan would bring bands in to play in our college town, because we're under 21 and we're living out. I went to school at Northern Illinois University, which is like 2 hours outside of Chicago. And we don't have a car. It's our only way we can see band plays is to bring them to us. And so and then I would meet people in the bands and the booking agents and all of this kind of stuff, and getting more involved in that community. And then when I graduated from college and moved into the city, I started my own band and got more involved in that. And it was just like, it was again, like something, it was just like pinball and anything else. It's like you find your people who care a stupid amount about this thing that you care a stupid amount about, and you've always got that to bring you together, right? And then when I find that, it's like I want to bring it to other people. Like, it was really powerful putting on concerts, because like I would have these bands come play and 500 people would come, and they're having the time of their life, and it's because of me. And like working on pinball machines was the same thing. Like I would write software for a pinball game, we'd put it out there, and I could watch people use it, and it's like that level of connection was really important. And I've always like sought that out, like to get, like when I find a niche interest like that I really, really love, to find that level of community and to get involved with it and give back to it, to give some back to it that it had given to me. And that's always been really important to me. And so when I look at to bring that forward to the time when I quit drinking, like that was part of the reason that I had those people around me, was because of these connections that had formed through the music scene. But it's interesting that you talk about like the musicians who are like kind of straight edge or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's like, I hadn't even really thought about this much, but there's a band from DC called Fugazi that was run by a guy named Ian Mackay, who was in a band called Minor Threat. And he kind of invented the straight edge scene. And they were a really inspiring band to me, and they wrote very political lyrics, and they wrote about like feminism and about like, and about being involved in community. And I would see them all the time. I probably saw them like a dozen times, and they were just an incendiary, incredible live experience. And them as a band inspired me a lot during that period too. Like they were in my ears and in my head a lot during that period too. and they've always been a really important band to me. And it's just interesting for me to just like almost just now be putting that together. Like, I mean, I'm sure it's like something that I realized at the time or
Yeah.
have realized over time. And it's like, obviously I knew that this band was really important to me, but the timing of it is something that I had never really thought about very deeply before, you know?
Yeah, and that's really powerful and it's interesting. I think, one of the themes, and I don't always pick up on themes like when I'm uh in the conversation, especially with someone, but one of the big themes I think of is just like the perceptions or the misconceptions and stereotypes that we might kind of come into looking at or kind of navigating different people in different worlds. Like you talked about alcoholism in that context and how what people might think and perceive. And then I even mentioned like this idea of like, I realized like, oh yeah, this stereotype around like, you know, uh and I maybe this is like more of a hard rock thing, but even then, like the idea of like party hard and break lamps and in hotels, and I'm 30, so I don't know if that's like a
Yeah.
thing that has existed much in my lifetime, but that's definitely a narrative that's been out there. And the reality is like that's not I think some of the really beautiful things that I've found in like music communities are what you've spoken about, and speaking about like political issues and speaking up for what's right. And it actually reminds me of an interview I did. Most hopefully everyone here who's listening to the sound of my voice knows that I also have a wrestling podcast on RHAP. Rob has a podcast, obviously, and it's the Wrestling Rehab Up, and I talk about pro wrestling with the incredible Mari Forth, who's also on RHAP, talking about so many things. But I grew up as a wrestling fan, and one person I was a big wrestling fan, her or was a big wrestler at the time, women's wrestler, now a Hall of Famer in the WWE. Her performing name is Lita. Her name is Amy Dumas, and I always like gravitated to her just as a performer because she was different. Like she had this red hair and like was a rocker kind of chick type of person. And I even remember reading her book when it came out, like maybe about 20 years ago when I was a kid. So I was a big fan, and I interviewed her a few years back, and she was talking about how much punk rock influenced her and how much the community influenced her. And she talked about this DIY ethic, as she put it, like do it yourself, which totally even speaks to what you talked about with putting on concerts and the like. So that's one thing that kind of came up. And, the other piece is that, she, I think just kind of make a connection is that she had a theme song that's by this band, Boy Hits Car. And one of the things I love about Boy Hits Car is just that in their like live music version of her theme song, Love, Passion, Fury, Energy is the name of it. They're talking about like women's rights and feminism. And I'm like, I didn't expect that, but those are values, that I have. Those are values that Amy has. And I think it's cool that like we could find that community in doing the right thing in places that we don't always expect it. So you kind of reminded me of that. It actually kind of brings me back around in general to this idea of community. There are so many different things, Greg, that we could touch on, but so we talked about like the music side of things. You mentioned pinball and the community. And you mentioned like the type of work that you do and as a content strategy person, but I really want to talk about community I'm sure as we get over the hump of whatever middle point. Well, I don't know where the middle point was, but we definitely got over the hump of that. And so like, yeah, like could you talk about that as someone who, has a podcast out there, hopefully keeps interviewing people and keeps going with it whenever you want. I know how that is. Like you kind of could do it on your own timeline, which is how I do it with my own podcast, my other thing, Let's Care, that I started years ago. But yeah, like I'm kind of curious what you've like learned about community over this time, either through your own experiences or through talking with people and asking them questions about it.
Yeah, so I mean, we've talked about two of my main communities, which are pinball and music, and then the third one was that about 15 years ago, I got
Mhm.
started to get involved with so there's a piece of software that you use to create websites, and it's called Drupal, and
Right.
it's open source, so it's very community driven, which is that, like, basically community builds this software, and I started using it professionally, and I found us and I quickly found a bunch of like-minded nerds, basically, is what it comes down to. And I saw a
Mhm.
situation in which I wanted to get involved with these like-minded nerds, but I also saw a professional opportunity with, a piece of software that was growing in popularity and that I could, turn into a professional opportunity too. And those two things drove me to get very involved in this Drupal software for a long time. And I was contributing to it, and I was speaking at conferences, and I was traveling all over the world. It ended up leading me to be able to live in Europe for a year and a half, working for a company that did Drupal services over there.
Mhm.
And it was a very big part of my life for a long time. And it was the first time when I started, because it was really about community collaboration, right? And we're talking about like hundreds of people collaborating to make something happen, thousands in some cases. And I it was very different from like pinball, where or like the music scene, where it's like I'm in a band with four people and we go and do our thing, and we interact with other people who are doing their things, like people who run venues or whatever. But ultimately it's four of us doing, it's lots of collections of small people coming together to make something bigger, right? Whereas
Mm.
this was a lot of people all coming together on one thing to make it happen. And over time I started sort of observing and feeling like the ways in which that worked well and the ways in which it didn't work well. And I started reflecting on past experiences with communities as they grow, especially, and the growing pains that communities can go through, and the ways that you can govern and lead communities and shape them, and what shapes them, and how you set their values, and all of these kinds of things. And and that became a real topic of thought for me for a long time. And I did some presentations about like community for Drupal, and some writing and things like that. But when the pandemic came, it was like I started it really started making me think about like what community, like communities were getting broken. Like I spent a lot of time in the years leading
Yeah.
up to the pandemic traveling a lot for work, like going to conferences, going to see clients, etc., and all of that was blown apart. And the pinball scene's the same way. Like pinball is not very hygienic. I'm just going to be very honest about it right now. You got a bunch of people all touching the same thing over and over all day long. And it's like so during the pandemic it didn't make very it was like not a thing that you could do,
Right.
and it's like all of these communities were like kind of broken up in a way, and they need to figure out a way to hold together. And that's when I started thinking about the podcast, and about like and about talking to, and I was also having different ideas, because it's like one of the things that really fascinates me is that when it's that whole thing of I was talking about earlier. When people come together to see a band play, a community is formed in that moment. And there's a community between the band and the audience. And there's expectations there, and there's kinds of norms and rules around it. And sometimes those norms are followed and sometimes they're not. And like, what is the role of each of those participants in that community that comes together in that moment, and thinking a lot about like different aspects and definitions of community and all of this kind of thing. And so I wanted a place to explore that, in part because I thought people would find it interesting, and in
Yeah.
part just because the way that my mental process works is that I figure things out by talking about them. And so this was a way for me to talk about it. And so that was sort of where the podcast came together. And I was just trying to reach out to different people who I thought would have an interesting take on it. Like, when I talked to Rob, it was really interesting because it's like this community came together around him in a way that was not very intentional on his part. Like in a lot of ways, early
Right.
on, he was very reactive to the idea that this community was forming around him. And it wasn't until fairly recently that he became more proactive about it. And I thought that
Mhm.
was really interesting because it worked out either way.
Right.
And to some extent, I think that's just due to the types of people that he happened to attract in the community that they formed.
Mhm.
But it was also interesting to see like, I'm very much into forming community very intentionally and setting the guidelines up front and setting expectations up front. But here was a community that was not set that way, and it had come out to be a really great collection of people, and I thought that was interesting too. So it's like I just wanted to talk to a lot of different people about different aspects of community, and it's been so central to my life. And it's funny because I've got all these little niche communities with like super close friends in each of them that don't necessarily like know each other, or in some cases know that each other exists and stuff like
Yeah.
this, which is kind of funny and interesting sometimes. But it's like, it's just how things have worked for me. And so I did 15 episodes, and then I was getting to a point where like I hit one of those walls where I was like, I had a bunch of people I wanted to talk to, and I couldn't book anybody, or they weren't
Yeah.
returning my messages and stuff. And then
Yeah.
I just kind of hit a place where I was like, I'm gonna let this sit for a while. And I plan to get back to it at some point, but for right now, it's kind of on hold.
And that's the thing. That's something I could relate to. I
Mhm.
referenced like my own project Let's Care, where where in 2017 I think part of it was also the search for community, in a way of like needing to talk with people who were looking to make some kind of impact in the world. But then that kind of evolved into me interviewing people who also were like not necessarily like black and queer specifically, but just like people whose voices you didn't often hear from, and people whose identities are often on the margins. And I found so much community in that, because I look at the people that I've interviewed and still continue to interview, not only on Pod Friends, which is like a whole other conversation. And I'm not going to get that meta and talk about Pod
Yeah.
Friends right now, but well, but I mean, I look at that and I think of my experiences, especially like I think particularly as a black person going to like a mostly white, almost, I mean, I guess virtually all white, like college, but also high school, and working in a world where I still constantly find myself being like the only one or one of the only ones in the room, and reaching out and like finding those people virtually, oftentimes interviewing them, is something that's been really powerful for me. And I mean, actually, yeah, to like give the Pod Friends comparison and the RHAP comparison, it has been so incredible just to be able to talk with people. Like I relate to, I guess there's a lot I don't know. I guess one thing that I think is great sometimes about myself, but also something that is frustrating, is that I think sometimes, like, I have some people who think like, Matt, you're an extrovert. Like, you're at that. I'm like, oh my gosh, it is such a struggle to like even like reach out and have the conversation. Like, I will not pick. I mean, probably like a lot of millennials, young millennials, even Gen Z, like, you're not picking up the phone and calling people and reaching out like that. And I love when people do that, because like I will answer and talk with them, and I appreciate that. But I mean, at the same time, like, some of us, it's just like tougher, kind of to what you said, of like feeling like an outcast at times. I have felt like that. I still feel like that at times, which I think is wild to people. A lot of people who know me outside looking in. And it's nice to kind of have a nice little mechanism of like, let's talk and like get to know each other
Mhm.
and like appreciate each other. But then also let me talk about how difficult it is sometimes to do that. And you gain understanding. Like, I feel like I have a much better understanding of you, and I'm sure the listeners do, and I'm sure they also have a better understanding of me after each conversation. And so there's so much to be said, so much that we could dive into, Greg. But kind of as we start to wind down, one, I just want to give you the space if there are any reactions or thoughts or anything on on the tip of your tongue that you wanted to mention. Maybe less of a question and more like, I've been talking for a minute, so you might have some thoughts there.
No, I think that one of the things that's like, I think that everybody has a story to tell, and everybody has
Mm,
something that they can share with the world, and it's
mhm.
like, I remember a while ago like before you started Pod Friends, I started going through the old episodes of the Terrence Show, and
Yeah.
like, and I was just like blown away by like all of these fascinating lives that everybody has led. Like, you know, Puya's story of being born in Iran and then moving to Dubai, and you know, his interactions with his family and his immigration to Canada, and you know, and and you know, I was listening to Sarah just last week. You were
Yeah.
talking to Sarah Carradine, and she
Hmm.
talks about, and anytime anybody is like, oh, I was a young punk rocker, it's like my head perks up, because it's like I know instantly there is a connection there, whether either of us realizes it or not, right?
Yeah.
And like everybody's perspectives are so fascinating, and they open our world up so much. Like when I lived in Europe, and you know, I lived in Europe, like I could walk down the street and pass for a Swede as long as I didn't open my mouth. But even that
Right.
experience was like so eye-opening to me, to like live literally in another culture for a year and a half. And it's like it like changed the way that I look at the world in a lot of ways, because I had to force myself into somebody else's world, right? And I think that these interviews are like that too, you know.
Hmm.
Like for a while, it's like the perspectives that people bring are things that we never consider. Like when you had Latanya on last
Yeah.
week, like we both come from Chicago, but she came from a very different Chicago than I did.
Right.
And I knew that Chicago existed, and you know, um but like I never had any insight into it, right? And now I have
Hmm.
like insight into it, and I have a perspective on it that I never had before. And that was really amazing for me, and I think it's amazing for a lot of people. And I hope that, you know, I can provide that some small amount of that for people as well. And
Yeah.
you know, and you know, I mentioned on Twitter the other day that I love like all of this storytelling that's happening in the RHAP community right now, that you're doing and that T-Bird is doing, and that, you know, all of these stories that are coming out. And I think I just think it's a really great way for us to learn from each other.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, you that is like that's everything you said there is so powerful, and the the thing that jumps out to me, number one, just to echo, you mentioned Taryn, who's been phenomenal having conversations, with people going back to pretty much around the time that I started interviewing people, not in the RHAP world, probably
Yeah.
before I even knew what RHAP was, but like I love that he's been doing T-Bird with her conversations, and she's just so phenomenal, and we had a great conversation to start out this season. Both of them, I guess, started out
Mhm.
the different seasons of Pod Friends, and then you talk about the things that we gain and we learn. And one of my one of the things that I really hope for, I'm actually just starting to like ask for people to, like, listeners, anyone who's listening, whoever's hearing the sound of my voice now, to submit a voicemail, which I'm sure I'll plug at the start and end of the episode, but like speakpipe.com/podfriends, because like there's the benefit that like we have as interviewers and people in conversation, where we learn and gain from that conversation. But I definitely do not know like the impact that these conversations and things that people hear have on other people, and it's just helpful to hear that, to know to keep going with it.
Mhm.
I mean, there's a lot going on in the world, and one of the things that's just so motivational with this is hearing how these different stories reflect on people, or why hearing about like Latanya's story of how she grew up in the south side of Chicago, or Sarah's story of growing up and kind of like embracing theater and learning
Mhm.
from that, like how these different stories really matter to them, is so important to me, because like this community has meant so much for me. And you started out this episode talking about how much it means to you, or what it's meant to you, and kind of how you got involved. But like for me, it's meant so much. And I really, like, for me, I'm like, tell me, like, let me know what it is, not for an ego thing, but really for like from a meaning sake of like, why does this matter, and what value does this add for you in your life and in whatever it is. Like, it's not it's as much of a Rap fan as I am. Like, I recognize Pod Friends in one sense, it is like the most Rap podcast because we're just diving deep with everyone who's in it, but it's also like not a very happy podcast. Like, it's like we go all over the place. We dive into like deep issues and subjects sometimes, and that's what it is. And I'm so glad that it can be that, and that Rob and the RHP team have given me the space to do this. But yeah, like, it's I appreciate you sharing that a lot. Kind of what's resonated, and I hope that others will too. But Greg, we're kind of getting to that point.
Oh, here we go.
The point. I mean, the thing is, you kind of know where I'm going, and we're getting to the point where we start to wrap up a little bit, and of course, I'll give you some time for like just wrapping us up and final words. But I have to ask, if your life were a book or documentary, what would the title be and why?
I remember thinking about this after you asked on your very first episode, like, wow, what would I name a documentary about or a book about my life?
Yeah.
And I still don't know. So it's funny, like I am by nature a fairly cynical guy. Like my cynicism is in my nature, but I'm also like, obviously it's a dichotomy because my nature is to be very cynical, but my actions are to have hope, because you don't get so involved in communities if you're not trying to make the world a better place, right? And a while ago I got a tattoo right here, which you can see. And
oh wow, on your arm.
It's Icelandic, and it's a set of lyrics from a band named Sigur Rós, who are from Iceland. And I won't butcher the Icelandic, but it translates to the best thing God has created is a new day. And and it's not a religious thing for me. I'm not religious, but I feel like the message is very powerful. Like every day, no matter how bad it is, tomorrow's a new one where you can start fresh, right? And it's something that, I once told somebody that, and they're like, oh, so you're an optimist. And my response was, if I was an optimist, I wouldn't have needed to affix this to my arm where I could see it every day. But also it's like I do think it's a very powerful and important message. And so anyways, the last part of that, a new day, is in Icelandic, pronounced Enia Dagur. And that's like what I would name. I wrote a post about getting this tattoo and what it meant to me and stuff like that, and I called it Enia Dagur, and that's what I would name probably the book about my life as well, which is probably kind of pretentious and obscure, but there it is.
I mean, my only problem with it is that I have no clue how to spell it. But you will have to send me the lyric or something in Icelandic to. I'm reading. I'm attempting to read Greg's arm.
Read my arm. Yeah.
In this moment. Yeah, but like, thank you for taking out this time and being part of this. And I don't know. I always feel like I come to this. And we were talking about this beforehand, but I come to this point in podcasts, I guess with everybody, where I'm like, oh, we're an hour, and we're probably about like an hour. We're about an hour, almost hour 30 in, maybe with my intro also added in, somewhere in that ballpark. And like, people could have stopped listening 2 minutes in before I finished the intro. Sorry, Greg, if they stopped listening before I finished my intro.
People get what they get out of it,
Exactly. And that's kind of the point. But I always really value and kind of want to be friends with the people who make it to the end, which the beauty of it is I could say that because they're the only ones who are going to hear this. So Thank you. And that's another reason why I'm like, who are our people? Like the people who really love these conversations and love to dive into the end. And you know where to find me as always. I said this at the end of the Latanya episode too, but like, you know where to find me. Let me know who you are. Slide into the DMs in a non-creepy way. And we could, it's always just cool. It's cool to know that you're out there. But Greg, I don't really have any other questions for you. There's so much there's so much more we could talk about, but I don't have any more questions for you for today. More than anything else, I just want to kind of give you the space to for any like any final thoughts or words. By the way, I just want to say this. I didn't even bring up the fact that I found out again in my deep research about the fact that you have been in a number of rock bands, including one named Buzz Muscle. Buzz Muscle.
Yes.
That's like the most pro wrestling. Yeah, Buzz Muscle. Macho Man, Randy Savage, Buzz Muscle. Yeah, I like that. So I didn't even go there.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about the fact that Buzz Muscle has a record in the Smithsonian Institution's Museum of Design.
Wow. Okay, we have to try. I have to track that down.
That's another one. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well,
it looks like bacon.
There's what? I'm annoyed now. I'm like, there's there's a part two.
we did a record. We based the packaging was inspired by looking like a package of Oscar Mayer bacon. They were doing a show at the Cooper Hewitt Museum, which is the Smithsonian Institute's design museum, about mixing messages and riffing off of industrial design. And they asked us if we could be a part of it because we had done that with our record. And that was like the story.
Greg, everyone, this is the part I love. Just the acknowledgement that there's so much more. Like I don't know how many hours of conversation each guest has in them, but I always know it's more than what I'm able to do within Pod Friends. So I'm thankful for that. Any closing words that you want to share with the community? Especially just speaking directly to the listeners who've made it to this point.
No, I don't think so. Just thanks to you for having me on and for making this space for everybody. I think it's really great.
Short, sweet.
Yeah.
Greg Dunlap. There we go. Awesome. But I wasn't calling you short, by the way. But
I'm not short. So
how tall are you?
I'm like 6'2".
Great note to end on. Thanks, Greg.
Sure.
Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning into this week's conversation with Greg. And I have so much love for Greg. I just appreciate how open he is, how unique he is, how much of himself he brings to the conversation. And the reality is, as we kind of landed on the end of the conversation, there's so many more hours and hours of conversations we could have about his life and all sorts of stuff. But I'm glad that he shared what he did. And I hope that this was meaningful for you. And if it was, please leave a voicemail. I would love to hear. Again, I have only received one voicemail. Yes, I'm telling you that so that you pity me along the way. Please, if you're hearing this, submit a voicemail because I really would love to have a handful of them to do a special episode where I kind of look back and celebrate a bunch of the guests. So again, leave a voicemail, speakpipe.com/podfriends. If you submit it and you don't like it, let me know. I'll throw it in the trash. You could be anonymous. You could identify yourself, whatever you want to be, but would love for you to do that. And again, thanks to the folks who plan to do it. Otherwise, you could check me out at Matt Scott GW on social media. If you go to the link in my bio, which is a Linktree link, linktr.ee/Matt Scott GW, you are able to see all the things I'm up to. You can subscribe, obviously, to Pod Friends if you're not subscribed already. leave a review, rate the podcast. You could subscribe to the Wrestling Rahapa, my podcast with the one and only Mari Forth at Mari Talks Too Much on social media, a previous Pod Friends guest. You could check me out on Crime Scene, talking about the documentary Gladbeck with Mari and with Sarah Carradine, who is another former Pod Friends guest. And also you could watch me on the live reality game LRG Survivor Philadelphia 2. So that's what I've got for this week. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate you. I am super thankful. And as I said to Greg, love and just kind of like want to know and hug those who are hearing the sound of my voice right now at the end of this podcast, because it does mean a lot. And like, maybe I'm a friend in your head, but like, you're a friend and I appreciate you and I'm grateful for you. And so, as I say at the end of each and every one of these episodes, again, just so genuinely grateful for you and thank you for being a pod friend.